The hearing will come to order. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to take a moment to welcome you and to recognize the subcommittee's hearing called today to receive testimony on House Resolution 906, the Global Climate Change Research, Data, and Management Act of 2007. This is an important bill that will help us to better address climate change in the country, and I want to thank my colleagues, Representative Mark Udall and Ranking Member Bob Inglis, for taking action and introducing this legislation. Through bills like H.R. 906, Congress is starting to take action to address the global conundrum that is climate change. It is not an exaggeration to say that the world's future depends on our response. The clock is ticking, and Congress must work across party lines to pass concrete solutions as soon as possible. I think this bill represents just that kind of needed bipartisanship. At this time, I'd like to recognize the author of the legislation, Representative Udall, for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Good afternoon to the panel and my colleagues that have joined us here. I want to begin by thanking the Chairwoman Giffords for holding this hearing on H.R. 906, the Global Change Research and Data Management Act of 2007, that I introduced earlier this year with my colleague and our ranking member, Mr. Inglis. I look forward to working together as this bill moves forward. The U.S. Global Change Research Program has been in existence in some form since the late 1970s. Support for the diverse array of climate-related sciences in the 11 agencies of the federal government has expanded our knowledge of Earth's land, water, and atmospheric systems. The outstanding science produced by our nation's scientific community has gained the U.S. worldwide recognition as a leader in climate science. This research has been shared with the rest of the world through international scientific organizations such as the World Meteorological Organization and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The evolution of global science and the global change issue sparked the need to make changes to the 1978 National Climate Program Act and gave us the Global Change Research Act of 1990. It's now time for another adjustment to alter the focus of the program governed by this law. The debate about whether climate change is occurring and about whether human activity has contributed to it is over. As our population, economy, and infrastructure have grown, we have put more pressure on the natural resources we all depend upon. Each year, fires, droughts, hurricanes, and other natural events remind us of our vulnerability to extreme weather and climate changes. The human and economic cost of these events is very high. With better planning and implementation of adaptation strategies, these costs can be reduced. For all of these reasons, we need the USG CRP to produce more information that is readily usable by decision makers and resource managers in government and in the private sector. People throughout the country and in the rest of the world need information they can use to develop response, adaptation, and mitigation strategies to make our communities, our businesses, and our nation more resilient and less vulnerable to the changes that are inevitable. We must also move aggressively to reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we are to avoid future increases in surface temperature that will trigger severe impacts that we cannot overcome with adaptation strategies. We need economic and technical information, as well as information about system responses and climate responses to different concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The USG CRP should be the vehicle for providing this information. Madam Chairwoman, we have a very distinguished panel of witnesses here today, several of whom have a great deal of experience with the USG CRP. I look forward to your testimony and welcome your suggestions for improvements to H.R. 906. Our goal is to ensure that the excellent science produced by this program is expanded and translated into user-friendly information to deliver the solutions our nation needs to address the challenge of climate change. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Udall. Now I'd like to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Inglis of South Carolina, for his opening statement.
I thank the Chair, and I thank the Chair for holding the hearing, and Mr. Udall for giving me the opportunity to work with him on this bill. This is an opportunity of bipartisan cooperation, and I think it makes sense because this is a bill that can increase our awareness and our preparation for the impacts of climate change. Of course, I hope we can also move forward and develop consensus on mitigation as well. And the necessary start of that is the attempt to build consensus. And so I thank Mr. Udall for doing that in pursuing this bill, and I'm happy to be with him on the bill. And very excited about hearing from the witnesses here today. And, our current climate science programs at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the National Science Foundation, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the U.S. Geological Survey have made great gains in deepening our understanding of global change, of climate change, from what's causing it to how our country and others might be affected. The sheer volume of data calls for an intelligent data management system, which is designed to fulfill the needs of its users. The program must meet the additional challenge of presenting the data in a relevant form to users that have non-scientific backgrounds, like state and local government operators. So in South Carolina, I've been hearing from fishermen and hunters who are particularly concerned about fish and animal population changes that could threaten our local ecotourism businesses. South Carolina's tourism business is actually the largest industry in our state, especially at our coast. And so we are aware of the goose that's laying the golden eggs down at our coast, and we want to make sure that it continues to lay them there. So this bill, as I say, the opportunities for building awareness and preparation, I think will help, and I'm happy to be part of it, and happy to hear from the witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis. I ask unanimous consent that all additional opening statements submitted by subcommittee members be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. It is my pleasure now to introduce this excellent panel of witnesses that we have with us here this afternoon. First, we have Dr. Michael MacCracken, who is the Chief Scientist for Climate Change Programs at the Climate Institute here in Washington, D.C. Mr. MacCracken served as the Executive Director for the U.S. Global Change Research Program from 1993 to 1997, and he has brought with him a stack of documentation that he can't leave with us, but I'm sure he's going to speak about in terms of the data that exists. Second, we have Dr. Jack Fellows, who is the Vice President for Corporate Affairs at the University Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, and the Director of UCAR's Office of Programs. Dr. Fellows helped to initiate the U.S. Global Change Research Program when he worked in the Executive Office of the President's Office of Management and Budget. Thank you for being here, Dr. Fellows. Dr. James Mahoney currently serves as an environmental consultant, providing scientific and professional advice to a number of organizations. From April 2, 2002 to March 30, 2006, he was Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Oceans and Atmosphere and Deputy Administrator of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Organization. During this period, Dr. Mahoney served as the Director of the U.S. Climate Change Science Program. It is so terrific having you here today. We had a chance to speak a little bit earlier, and we are thrilled that you're here with us. Thank you, Dr. Mahoney. Mr. Franklin Mutter is the President of the Reinsurance Association of America and a member of the University Center for Atmospheric Research's Board of Trustees. Good to see you, Mr. Nutter. Dr. Phil Mote is a Washington State climatologist and an affiliate professor at the University of Washington. His research has focused on Northwest climate and its effects on snowpack, stream flow, and forest fires. Thank you, Dr. Mote. And Ms. Sarah Bittleman is the Director of the Governor of Oregon's Washington, D.C. office and is testifying today on behalf of the Western Governors Association. And I know that Arizona's Governor Janet Napolitano obviously is very active with that association as well. So welcome to all of you. Let me just say that we do have a short series of votes that we don't know when they will come, but we believe that we should be adjourned by 4. So my goal is to make sure that the testimony is limited to 5 minutes, which goes by very quickly, and you'll see the indication in terms of the lights. It's important that we get through because we have obviously a panel of wonderful witnesses. We've got questions, but I just want to make sure that we don't lose members because I know that we're going to be leaving for the weekend, and I want to make sure that we keep everyone here as long as we can. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing, and when all 6 of you have completed your testimony, we will begin with questions, which will be, again, for 5-minute increments. So, Dr. MacCracken, if we can begin with you, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was asked to address two questions during my testimony having to do with lessons learned during the national assessment that took place and what are some specific tasks necessary to get an ongoing assessment process. I also want to just say a few words about program in general. I think the U.S. GCRP is a very unique activity. It's trying to get agencies working together. I came in as the first executive director of the office to get the 10 agencies really participating and working together, and my job description said, and you don't have control of the money. So you have to make it happen, which is by driving it with ideas. I think a great deal was accomplished with some inspired leadership. There were international field programs that combined the activities of NASA with their satellites and NOAA with their aircraft and ships and NSF with their capabilities. And so we learned a lot about El Nino and the ozone hole and things. What has happened since, unfortunately, even though there are more and more questions coming up, the budget has been dropping. The proposal, I think, for fiscal 2008 is about 25% below in sort of even dollars what it was in the 1990s, even though there are more questions. And so we're ending up doing less. So I think to get the program going, what's needed is some highly qualified leadership to get the funding up again and then to work hard on the assessment activity. So for the assessment activity, what I brought here and what the chairwoman commented upon was the reports that came out from the national assessment, which you've heard. There aren't many places where they're compiled. This is one of the few sets. But what was talked about and what's sometimes talked about in the bill is the report that is delivered to Congress. And that turned out to be this report. And then there was a supporting thicker report. But at the same time, what was going on was a process all around the country. There were sort of 20 regions that held workshops. There were 5 sectoral studies. And so each of those was an ongoing activity. And so there's Alaska, and there's health, and there were forests, and Great Lakes, and a whole host of activities going on there. Because while global change starts at the global scale, when you look at it, how we're changing the global atmosphere, impacts start at the local scale. And you just have to have the local people involved. There was an EPA assessment that went on in the late 80s where they tried to basically study 5 representative regions, one of them being California, where I was. They appointed a panel of, I think, 12 or 13 scientists. It had 1 Californian on it. It got no attention whatsoever in the state. What happened in this last assessment go-around was the activity was based at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and when they had the workshop, they had a majority of members of the Energy Commission there, the California Air Resources Board, and a whole bunch of other groups. They involved local people. And California's effort took off, even though there wasn't enough money provided to them to, in the end, publish their report. They got so many people going and so many people interested on the critical problems. So I think it's really important to do that. There are just all kinds of people who are interested. Planners want to know about what's going to happen to the likelihood of floods. Farmers and hunters and fishermen in South Carolina want to know what's going to happen to the temperature of the streams or the state of the forest and if they're going to dry out so much that you get fires. There's just a lot of information that can be provided. Indeed, there are uncertainties, and there's a lot more research to be done, but there's an awful lot of guidance that one can give with respect to these activities. And so in the testimony, I go through a number of steps that I think need to be taken. One is to make sure that you call not just for a report for Congress, but for a capability for the country to address and face up to the impacts of the issue. Insist as you do that there's stakeholder involvement. Insist as you do to use the word global change instead of climate change. That's a subtle difference, but it means you're really going to do climate change in the context of everything else, not just do climate change all by itself, which isn't particularly useful. Do consider mitigation and adaptation. I think it's going to be important to find a way to provide funding that goes for assessment. as we were dealing with the agencies, it was hard for them to consider assessment research. And yet the definition in the Global Change Act and in this bill have assessment as under research. That doesn't work very well. Some of them legally say they can't do it. And so I think you're really going to have to find a way to provide separate funding. I think there need to be these strong regional components. We tried to work up to 20. We ended up being able to fund 15 and couldn't find funding for sort of the other 5 that we thought covered the country. And there were a couple of reports like the one in the Southwest for Native peoples that the report got all done, but there was never funding around to publish it. It was very unfortunate at the end. So you need, I think, some regional centers. I think it's also important to look nationally and look at some sectors. So we looked at agriculture and water resources and human health and coasts and forests and stuff. Forests. And so there's those, but there's a whole host of additional ones to be looking at: rural communities, extreme events, and other things. And then have an independent synthesis that can be done. So signals down there, but let me just conclude by saying I think a lot can be done in a year, but you can't get all the way there in a year. And if you try and do it all in a year, you won't be doing the kind of effort that you really need to have happen.
Dr. MacCracken, Dr. Fellows, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'd like to thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify on H.R. 906. In addition to my personal involvement in the creation of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, I want to UCAR, this consortium of 7 universities, has been involved in this program for 15 years as well. The subcommittee asked me to address the following questions. What are the major strengths and weaknesses of the U.S. Global Change Research Program? Are the current program funding levels adequate for adaptation and mitigation research and characterizing national vulnerability to climate change? And how can we ensure that resource managers and policymakers' needs are met by the program? Let me start by describing the current U.S. Global Change Research Program's strengths. The program's always been focused on producing a sound scientific basis for policymaking. It's developed a unique interagency mechanism that provides a critical mass and focus for planning, and it's periodically peer-reviewed. It's also made an effort to tie research and observational strategies to user needs, and it's clearly advanced the science over the last 7 years. Although it's not perfect, it does have some weaknesses. It's been impacted by political influences over the years, climate politics overshadowed by other priorities. Over its history, its leaders have not always been given the support and tools to make the tough decisions and trade-offs between program and agency priorities. It's been difficult at times to track the progress of the program, and it could clearly be more responsive to user. Let me turn to whether or not the program has adequate funding for adaptation and mitigation and characterizing national vulnerability. To discuss the budget, I'll be referring to the FY07 Our Changing Planet document. It's a report that is produced by the program every year. That report covers the years FY05 to 07. During these years, the funding was roughly at about $2 billion a year. This is not easy to do a critical analysis of balance. Typically, a National Research Council takes a couple of years to do this. But the program does have 5 goals, and the first 3 are focused largely on scientific advancement. The last 2 on adaptation, mitigation, and vulnerability analysis. Those last 2 goals represent about 25 to 30% of the current budget. That's about $300 million annually. So in my own judgment, I think that the balance is probably roughly right, and it actually includes a range of synthesis and assessment products that focus on national vulnerability, all the way from urban environments that we live in to even Arctic ice. Mr. England traveled to the Antarctic, and you've experienced those ice conditions. One balance issue that I would like to point out is between FY05 and 07, the observational support actually decreased by almost 30%, from $500 million to about $700 million. These were largely NASA science cuts due to other administration priorities that have weakened the program right at the time when we really need this kind of environmental observation. This reduction was actually highlighted in a recent National Research Council report that warned that our national environmental observation systems are at let me turn to whether or not we can ensure that resource managers and policymakers' needs are being met in this program. The programs actually have a long history of engaging stakeholders. The program sponsored in 2001 a national assessment of which researchers and stakeholders worked together in 20 regions of the United States to help identify user needs. Most of the synthesis and assessment products that came out of this effort continue to be an important part of the program and involve the stakeholders. But despite all these efforts, I do think that H.R. 906 would increase user input, and particularly on the planning and priority setting of the program. So in summary, I'd say that H.R. 906 is very timely. It's an important piece of legislation. We've learned a lot since 1990 on how to run an interagency program, and the demand for this information is clearly increasing. If there's anything I would recommend about H.R. 906, it has to do with improving the interagency process itself. The bill does need to further highlight the priority of this program so that it doesn't get diluted by other things. It's still a surprise to me that there's no aspect of this program included in the American Competitive Initiative, even though most of our economy is weather sensitive or climate sensitive. The bill also ought to identify, I think, a director of this program and an office of this program and give them the tools and support and clout to be able to make the tough decisions in terms of developing priorities. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks, Madam Chairwoman, and I'd be happy to answer questions when we get to it.
Thank you, Dr. Fellows. Dr. Mahoney, please.
So I address, of course, the entire panel with Ranking Member Inglis in particular, and I want to cite Mr. Udall, Chair in the main committee, too. I'm delighted to have the chance to address you today, and I'm a more recent veteran of these skirmishes, having spent 4 years in trying to make the interagency process work to a sensible outcome. So I associate myself very much with the comments that Dr. MacCracken made before, as well as those of Dr. Fellows just before me now. I'll mention one of them here again just as a highlight so that it won't be necessary for me to turn to it in my own comments quite as much. That is, I also bring the message that I would urge the committee and at the end of the day the Congress to take a more explicit position about how this program should be managed. On one hand, that is, after all, a function of the executive branch. But it isn't a function of the executive branch only to say that to be successful, a program like this must have a reasonably funded management and coordination office with a sense of permanence to it, and that the budget lines brought forward through OMB and ultimately in those that survived in the President's budget up here to the Hill have to recognize this kind of program very directly. One of the key weaknesses that I certainly observe in all the recent years is that there has been no move away from the concept that this is a program conducted in 13 parts by now 13 collaborating agencies. And with that view, they must set their own priorities and take them internally and then up to OMB. And that leaves no place to really solidify the view about the priorities for the whole program. So if I were to give any one message to this committee, even recognizing the separation of powers, so that I wouldn't propose that the Congress ought to explicitly lay out chapter and verse of organization and management, but I think some guidance being given by the Congress would be very helpful, because it's a long-term battle, and it pained me a great deal to see the lack of progress that was made in a number of areas, because it wasn't possible to break through some of these problems along the way. With that, let me press on to the rest of my comments very quickly here as well. Since the chair already introduced us, I won't take any more time on that, and I'll pass directly to the point that I have a series of comments that I divide into 3 parts. One are some overall comments, second set of comments on structure and resources for the program, and then third, some other suggestions as well. in my overall comments, the first is perhaps the most important. I certainly agree that the Global Change Research Act of 1990 is ready for a significant update. And I certainly agree with the sense of the current draft bill focusing on much more user interaction, much more assessment work and the like as part of that. So I simply applaud those efforts as to my best lights as being very much in place. Second point and overview, though, I want to raise the very important caution that we need to be careful that we don't just flip from one extreme to the other. In other words, that we don't de-emphasize the science to the point by saying that what we need to do is assessment and user interaction, which we must do. But if that all simply came at the expense of the underlying science, I would assert strongly that what we know now, yes, the question about human causation of global change is settled, but there are so many other very important science questions about regional impacts, abrupt climate change, and we could go on and make a list that would consume all the time here. So what I would suggest that what hopefully the Congress, this committee first, and then ultimately the Congress would deal with in this is something that recognizes the great need to pick up the user involvement and get going on that kind of assessment work, but to mate that with a continuing strong commitment to the underlying science. And then I also, as an overview comment, cite back some of the areas where I see the benefit of the things the committee is, that this bill, the current print has brought along. Requirements for stakeholder involvement, the major emphasis on improved data management, and a clear mandate for developing policy analysis statements as a basis for understanding our climate information. I would cite, somewhat in hindsight, that one of the reasons that the climate change science program was not able to address as much as it might have wanted of some of the underlying scientific information use questions was that there was no framework to put that against in terms of either one or more or a set of policies that are worth examining. So treating those things are a very good point. Now, I'll very quickly go to a close. I'll comment on structures and resources. First of all, there is no specific funding mechanism, neither authorization nor other guidance about approaches to funding in the bill, and I would commend that to your attention, given the great difficulty of making a long-term multi-agency program run. There continues to be a great need to assure the independence of the science. I think that's there in large part with the call for continued involvement with the National Academy. The Academy's involvement with the current program is now well in place under contract, and presumably this bill would do nothing to take that out of place. I'd look to see major O&B involvement in this activity, because it can't simply look at the pieces in the various lines, but it has to look at the program altogether. And as my colleagues have already commented too, there's a clear need for the bill to say something directly about the importance of the coordination office and its location in government and its funding. And then just the last closing comments. I believe some of the timelines now set out in the bill in the first year in particular are unrealistic. There's a call for 5 different reports to be done in the first year, and there's just no way. I'd bet a dime and make 20 cents on my bet that would happen in 1 year. So I would suggest that you might want to take another look at phasing those somewhat. Second, there's a need to call for a solid communication and education strategy in the bill too. So this deals so much with user involvement with the information, yet there's still no call for that kind of communication capability, and that was absolutely the poor orphan of everything we tried to do in recent years. So I'd hate to see that get left off without any kind of mandate in the law when this is done. And finally, there's a need to coordinate the reports and output from this program with the international activities and other U.S. government reporting activities in the climate area too. Simply to say, is my very last point, that since the IPCC, for example, which is just releasing its 4th assessment, and which will start a 6-year process toward its 5th assessment, it would be helpful for the bill to recognize something that would alternate phase between the international assessments and the major reporting responsibilities in the states, because many of the same group of scientists, hundreds of U.S. scientists, are involved in both of those activities. Many of them are the same people, and the quality is better if the pain is stretched out a little bit. Thank you very much.
Mutter, please.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, thank you. It's an honor to appear before you. Reinsurance is essentially the insurance of insurance companies. Insurance companies traditionally lay off risk, particularly catastrophe risk, notably extreme weather events, to the reinsurance market. No financial services business is more dependent on the vagaries of climate and weather than property and casualty insurers. The industry is at great risk if it does not understand climate change variability and the severity and frequency of extreme events. Understanding global climate change and integrating that information into the insurance system is an essential part of addressing climate extremes and conveying information to governments and the public about the economic consequences of human activity in the face of changing global climate. We believe that the enactment of H.R. 906, with an increased emphasis on input to government climate research by user communities such as ours, will greatly enhance adaptation and response to the effect of global change. The industry looks at climate change largely through the prism of the catastrophe losses that it pays. The General Accounting Office just released a report that from 1980 through 2005, private insurers and federal insurers, meaning the National Flood Insurance Program and the Crop Insurance Program, paid $320 billion in claims on weather-related losses. The insurance industry paid 2/3 of those losses. 2005 alone produced a record year. Total global insured catastrophe losses were $83 billion, 80% of which were U.S. landfalling hurricanes. As bad as those numbers are, AIR worldwide estimates that insured losses from natural catastrophes could be expected to double roughly every 10 years. With respect to the impact of climate change alone, fixing everything else in place, the Association of British Insurers concludes that the average annual losses from 3 major storm types affecting insurance markets, that's U.S. hurricanes, Japanese typhoons, and European windstorms, could increase by 2/3 by the 2080s. Climate change could increase wind-related insured losses from extreme U.S. hurricanes by about 3/4, the equivalent of 2 to 3 Hurricane Andrews annually. The ABI advises that these loss estimates do not include likely increases in society's exposure to extreme storms due to growing, wealthier populations and increasing assets at risk. These are their assessments based upon the impact of climate change. The catastrophe modeling firm Risk Management Solutions advises that financial losses from weather-related catastrophes have increased by an average of 2% per year since the 1970s, with climate change as a major factor, even when inflation, changes in wealth, and population are taken into account. It is quite clear that there are several factors affecting the losses associated with extreme events, including population growth in high-risk areas, certainly people moving to those areas, the dramatic increases in insured coastal values, the insurance industry's own expansion of coverage, and climate change and the incidence of more intense extreme events. We believe that H.R. 906, with greater emphasis on basic climate research, coordination among sponsoring government agencies, improved integration of user needs into the research agenda, and access to climate data will enhance risk assessment and lead to improved insurance markets. In this regard, our sector needs science-based business intelligence. A key component of the Global Climate Change Research Program are observation technologies. It will be critical to our ability to provide insurance markets that climate and weather data through observation capabilities be maintained. Perhaps the most relevant aspect of the insurance industry with respect to science assessment and extreme events is the use of catastrophe models. These models incorporate scientific assumptions about climate trends and the probability of future events, then produce estimates of prospective costs associated with these events.
In the context of the Global Climate Change Research Program and its reauthorization pursuant to H.R. 906, our industry would benefit from an enhanced research on historical extreme events, particularly those which predate satellite technology, climate research which addresses the effect of climate change on the frequency and intensity of extreme events would be of great value. Additionally, the consequences of climate change on extreme weather regionally would improve insurer adaptation strategies. A key component of this agenda, again, are observation capabilities. Our industry is taking steps to adjust to climate change, even though there is no insurance policy that covers climate change. It is our belief that H.R. 906 will be of great value in improving our capability. Insurers are in the business of assessing risk, pricing it, and providing financing or risk transfer. Its long-term strategy, however, does not include bearing the cost of climate change without a commitment on the part of society to pursue a mitigation strategy addressing both the causes and consequences of climate change. H.R. 906 is to be commended as placing greater weight on basic research that emphasizes user needs and maintains or enhances observation capabilities, and as well as the coordination of research with the global research community as well as private sector resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nutter. Gentlemen, I think probably the best plan would be to go through Dr. Moat. We have 15 minutes to get to the floor to vote, and if we can keep your testimony again to 5 minutes, then we'll recess and hopefully see you all back after we have a series of votes, so we can't split the group up and have half grow and half come back. So Dr. Moat will go to you, and then we'll recess and come back afterwards.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee, for your interest in climate monitoring research and applications. I'm Philip Moat, and I'm a research scientist. I'm involved in the Pacific Northwest Climate Impacts Group, which since 1995 has been articulating how climate influences natural resources, not just climate change, but climate variability. And we've also made great strides in discussing these findings with natural resource managers, getting their perspective, what they need, and what information they need from us. So I've been on both sides of doing basic science research and also more applied science. The Climate Impacts Group is one of 8 regionally funded teams funded by NOAA's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments Program. Unfortunately, the whole country is not covered by or served by RESA programs. As the science of climate variability and change has advanced tremendously since 1990, so too have the societal demands for information about climate and what it means locally. Some examples of how climate has advanced: climate models now consist of elaborate components that simulate the ocean and sea ice, land surface, biosphere, carbon cycle, as well as the atmosphere. And regional models are now capable of simulating climate in great detail regionally, and there's, in fact, a program underway called NARCAP, the North American Regional Climate Change Assessment Program, which is combining regional climate modeling for the whole country, coordinated by the National Center for Atmospheric Research. There's also been tremendous advances in paleoclimate, our ability to use tree rings and other so-called proxies to understand climate over time scales of hundreds to thousands of years that provide the context for understanding our current climate and possible future climate. Let me give you some examples of information that stakeholders have sought from the Climate Impacts Group or from the Office of Washington State Climatologists. Water utilities around the Northwest are factoring in climate change to long-range plans, so they want to know what are the probable changes in temperature, precipitation, snowmelt, stream flow, so that they can incorporate that as well as population and demand changes into their plans and their policies. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council wanted very detailed stream flow estimates for future decades so that they could calculate changes in hydropower production from the Columbia River Basin and the hydropower dams there. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is starting to think about what does it mean to change flood control rule curves that govern reservoirs, given that there's already been an observed shift of 2 weeks in the spring snowmelt. There's no policy that currently would allow them to make that move. But for starters, they need good detailed information. A natural gas utility wanted help demonstrating to the State Utilities and Transportation Commission that warming trends have rendered obsolete the old assumption of constant climate by which their rates are set. While a regional and state level focus is very valuable for connecting with these stakeholder needs and providing climate services, in a number of respects, a national level effort, a national climate service, is needed that would take the basic research that is provided by modeling centers and analysis and translate it into stakeholder needs. National level expertise in climate science can provide the highest quality, most comprehensive information about patterns of climate variation and change, both from the past and from future modeling. Such expertise can be brought to bear on problems that may be too difficult for a single regional group to solve. For example, to properly construct probabilistic scenarios of future climate change at a given location would ideally involve evaluating scenarios from tens of climate models against the observed record of the 20th century and then weighting their projections of future change according to how well they did with the past. This is a task that's both computationally and conceptually probably too challenging for a regional team like ours to undertake. Another challenge would be the construction of sea level rise scenarios, factoring in not just global sea level rise, but local relative land movements, obviously of great concern in the tourist-friendly beaches of South Carolina, which I had the good fortune to visit a year or two ago. All of these things, all these types of information are needed on very fine local scales and can be provided by a comprehensive national effort. Finally, a word about the unglamorous topic of monitoring the climate, which H.R. 906 rightly addresses. As numerous reports by the National Research Council and others have documented, the nation's various observing networks, and notably the Cooperative Observer Network that forms the backbone of long-term weather observations, and the stream gauge network of the U.S. Geological Survey, are slowly dwindling in coverage and, in some cases, quality. A vigorous effort is urgently needed to preserve these networks as our primary source of information for documenting the changes in our environment and our climate over the 20th century and into the 21st century in order to understand how best to cope with these changes. The American Association of State Climatologists calls on the 110th Congress to rescue these networks from decline. Finally, a national climate service with high-level buy-in from the administration and the various agencies would serve the needs for climate information of a wide spectrum of private and public sector entities, and H.R. 906 points us in that direction.
Thank you, Dr. Moat. The committee stands in recess.
Well, wait 5 years until you run for the... So I see that.
The hearing will come to order. I want to thank the panelists for your patience. I'm going to sit in as acting chair for Congresswoman Giffords, who was required to go to the airport and return to her home in Arizona. We'll pick up back with Ms. Bittleman for her 5 minutes, and then I would tell the panel we will do all that we can to end at the latest by 4 o'clock, perhaps 5 or 10 minutes early, but we do want to take advantage of your expertise and your presence. Ms. Bittleman, 5 minutes is yours.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee today regarding H.R. 906. My name is Sarah Bittleman. I work for the Governor of Oregon, Governor Kulongoski, here in Washington, D.C. I would like to thank the sponsors, Representative Udall and Representative Inglis, especially for their bipartisan effort on this bill, as well as for their outreach to the Western states in its development. The Western Governors Association, which I'm representing here today, appreciates the specific effort to make this bill relevant to and address the needs of the states. With the efforts occurring in Oregon and in many Western states to address climate change, the Western governors believe it is not only appropriate, but it is also necessary to reorient and fully fund the U.S. Global Change Research Program to make it more user-driven. The U.S. has spent considerable dollars on understanding the science of climate change. Now is the time to address and adequately fund the issue of adaptation. How will climate change manifest itself in different areas of the country? What impacts can we expect at the state and local levels? How can we prepare for the change in an effort to avoid or mitigate the impacts? How can we most effectively implement adaptation measures, given that many of them need a long lead time? At the risk of sounding like an advertisement for a summer blockbuster movie, I need to recite some of the very real effects of climate change projected for the American West. Smaller snowpacks that lead to water shortages, earlier snow melt that lead to water shortages, and yet more extreme floods, more evaporation and dryness, less groundwater, more drought, more wildfires, pests and disease more of them affecting our agricultural crops and forests. I don't think I need to remind the members of the committee that there are already substantial stresses on water in the West today. Given global climate change, we expect additional ones. The Western governors stated in their 2006 report entitled Water Needs and Strategies for a Sustainable Future that Congress and the administration should fund research that makes it easier to predict and mitigate climate change impacts. The governors believe Title I of H.R. 906 would appropriately focus the research of the U.S. Global Change Research Program on improving the understanding of global climate change, responding to the information needs of communities and decision makers, and providing periodic assessments of the vulnerabilities of the U.S. and other regions to global climate change. In other words, making the program more user-driven and user-friendly. Some states are already creating their own climate change research centers, including Oregon. In May 2006, Governor Kulongoski created the Climate Change Integration Group to develop a climate change strategy for Oregon that provides long-term sustainability for the environment, protects public health, considers social equity, creates economic opportunity, and expands public awareness. Their main focus has been on adapting to climate change. It's important that the program created under H.R. 906 integrates and supports the efforts of states that are already in existence, like the one in Oregon and across the West, as well as regional climate research and application centers. This includes the state climatologist offices, agricultural extensions, state and local governments, and resource management agencies. Additionally, Western governors stated in their 2006 report that the federal agencies must continue to and expand funding for data collection networks and activities necessary for monitoring, as Dr. Motes mentioned, assessing and predicting future water supplies. To the degree that Title II of the bill would lead to such improvements in data management, the governors certainly believe it's appropriate and support it. One recommendation that we would make for the bill is to amend it to address the need for a national climate information service in the context of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. A national climate service, as, again, Dr. Mote mentioned, such a service would be the focal point for coordination of climate activities across the federal government and could be the organization charged with such responsibilities as making sustained climate observations and assessments about the state of the climate and providing climate outlooks and projections, similar to an early warning system. Additionally, the NCIS could provide routine assessments of climate impacts and vulnerabilities and develop relevant products and services for decision and policy makers. The National Integrated Drought Information System that this committee authorized last year would thus become an important component of a larger climate information system. The Western states see all of this as very much connected. Decision makers at all levels of government and in the private sector need reliable and timely information to understand the possible impacts of the response and respond to the effects of climate change. The Western Governors Association supports H.R. 906 as an effort to move the nation's climate change research program in this direction. I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you, Ms. Bittleman. Thank you, members of the panel, for your excellent testimony. At this point, we'll open our first round of questions, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to start with a constituent, a Coloradan, Dr. Fellows. As you well know from your experience at the Office of Management and Budget in coordinating agency budgets for the USGCRP, the budget process for interagency programs is always a challenge, shall we say. Would you elaborate on your recommendation that the USGCRP Interagency Committee have, quote, a clear budget process linking tasks to agency and program budgets, end of quote? Are you saying that the director of the USGCRP must have budget authority over the agencies of the USGCRP? Would the director of OSTP, for example, be a good candidate for this function?
Well, there's a lot of options here, ranging from the current one where all the agencies retain their budgets to a completely centralized budget process. And I'm not sure that either end of the spectrum is the right way. But I do think there's an argument to be made for the director of of the U.S. Global Change Research Program to be close enough to political power, to have the clout to make the kind of decisions and trade-offs that you would across an agency, and probably to have some level of budget authority he can use to help encourage or provide incentives for people to make investments in the highest priority areas. We used to, when I was in OMB, have an annual budget review process where we actually called all the agencies in. They got a chance to present their programs. Every relevant budget examiner, representative of OSTP had a chance to hear their programs, got to see the links between the programs. And I thought that that was a pretty effective mechanism to try to never had the real clout to actually be able to say we need to move in one particular area. We had to rely on the goodwill between all the. I think that budget authority could help the director.
Anyone else want to comment on that particular question, given Dr. Fellow's expertise, but others have also faced this same dilemma?
Exactly. Mr. Udall, just a brief comment that perhaps it's trying to think pragmatically about what might work. I had somewhat of a hybrid position because I was a Senate-confirmed sub-cabinet officer, so I had, for better or for worse, my political standing over these recent years in managing the program. And I had access to the very top of OMB, OSTP, and exercise those, and to all of the relevant cabinet officers frequently enough. Still, what I recommend is close to what Dr. Fellows has just said, but I treat it a little bit differently. I think that there should be a definite recognized management and coordination function, because that's where, as little as it is, some very important things are done now in the communications area and in getting all these reports out, and they're tremendously under-resourced. The people in that office work very hard to get it done, but it's also a major source of delay because they're just overwhelmed. I think if we took that same office, and I wouldn't want to give any climate program head budget authority over a cabinet department. I don't think that makes sense. But if that function were placed in one of the departments, but clearly its role was to be subject to the review by the others, and it had a very small budget itself in that department, one part for its own manpower, for example, which wouldn't be much, and I actually have in my statement a recommendation about two other functions, close to what Dr. Fellows was talking about. One that would provide a small kitty of developmental and bright idea and filling the gaps funds that it could administer on a transfer basis or whatever else, and the other one to provide some seed money for some assessment work. And to my experience of working in the last several years on this anyway, having that capability with an element of budget which would flow through that department's own budget, but which would be clearly identified as funds to support this programmatic activity, would be a way to maintain the normal purity of the departments being responsible for their own budgets while having a relatively small budget that could reach around some. And that's an area where I would think that some direction by the Congress about its desire to see a more efficient and effective process, given the complexity of our government, would be a positive step.
Thank you, and I see that my time's expired. Doctor, I'll come back to you, and at this point I want to recognize my friend and co-author of this legislation. I want to thank Congressman Inglis again for his joining me in this important endeavor. And Mr. Inglis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Udall. And I am interested in the timeline that for updating the 10-year Global Change Research Plan. The bill calls for it being updated every 4 years, and I wonder if you all might want to comment on whether you think that's a sufficient schedule for updates, or will it become stale within that 4-year period, or have any thoughts about that?
Well, the first one was developed in about 1990 and had a theme that was very disciplinary. It had what were called 7 disciplinary areas, so ecology and things. We actually did develop an alternative approach in the mid-90s to try and cut it a different way, to focus on the stratospheric ozone issue, on seasonal to interannual, on climate change, and on, I think, land cover and things. There wasn't a formal plan put out, although there was in one of these Our Changing Planets, a set of objectives and a whole bunch of sort of activities that are not a whole lot different than what came out in the plan later. I think it's useful I'm not sure 4 years is the right number, but you do need to sort of take a different perspective. This is a very complex issue, and there's no optimal way to cut it into pieces. And so I think it helps to take different looks at different times and get different perspectives. We wanted to do that also on the national assessment, to come at it not the second time for climate change, because in 4 years that wouldn't have changed so much, but come at it, for example, on, well, what are all the factors affecting land cover that we have? Think about global change very broadly. What are the things that are affecting land cover? And so that partly is climate change and partly variability and partly atmospheric chemistry changes and a whole bunch of other things. So cut it differently, try and get some new insights. So requiring something in an update and some re-looking, I think, is useful. It can be a hard process, but it's useful.
And Dr. Fellows,
Just going to mention that the world climate science community every 5 years takes a look, it essentially takes a temperature of the new science in the climate arena. So I think 4 or 5 years is probably pretty reasonable. In the bill, and Dr. Mahoney touched on this, it actually talks about a 10-year research plan, an annual plan, a vulnerability plan, a policy plan, and they're all due the first year. It would be interesting to actually look at how that plan might change if you did the vulnerability and the policy assessment. So there's even some sequencing of how you would do these various reports, but a 4 or 5 year cycle is probably good for the program plan itself.
some people might say to us about this bill that, you know, you can collect information, but is it going to help us that much? And I'm thinking of the mountain trout, I believe it is, in the streams of North Carolina and a little bit of South Carolina in the mountains. Apparently 1 degree Fahrenheit, I believe it is, temperature change, and we have no more trout. It warms up 1 degree, they're gone from our rivers. And I guess the question is, it's helpful to know. I think it does build awareness. Is that right, Ms. Bittleman?
Yes, Mr. Inglis, I wanted to add to this. Having the assessments reviewed and updated, and the scientific data reviewed and updated periodically, whether it's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, is all very important. But from a state perspective, I think it's important to realize that the entire process of data collection and adaptation and how climate change is being experienced on the ground is really, to us, what the important aspect of this bill is, which is every year when data is being collected, at the same time, states like Oregon and in the Carolinas and Pacific Northwest, the Carolinas, the states are actually acting. We have user groups, we have climate change groups, we have scientists, but we also have economists and businesses that are really reacting to and trying to anticipate how their businesses are going to change. Salmon fishery is a very good example in the Pacific Northwest. We're looking at salmon populations all the time in conjunction with NOAA, and the question is, you know, is climate change going to, what are the long-term effects of climate change, and how are we as an industry, the salmon industry, how are they going to react to that? How can we help them react to that? So while I just would hope that you don't, you know, when there is a year date for a report, I don't think that is as important as the flexibility needed to incorporate all the information, science data, but also activities that are happening on the ground, including happening in the states and how.
Thank you. My time's expired.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll come back around for a second round if you all can stay. recognize myself again for 5 minutes. I want to start with Ms. Bittleman, but I would alert the panel that I'd like you all to think about weighing in when she's had a chance to answer. And I want to just talk about this regional versus national assessments dynamic that we have. We certainly need regional assessments and regional responses, but each individual region doesn't stand on its own. You get impacts, consequences in other areas. And for this reason, we need also national assessments. Would you agree, and if so, how do we ensure that the U.S. GCRP will serve both of these information needs?
Well, since I'm here representing a region, I'm going to fall on the side of preferring a regional approach, but I think you're absolutely right. We do need national information and a national approach. Again, I don't see these things as actually separate. In Oregon and in the Pacific Northwest, we would like to collect climate information on a watershed and sub-watershed level. That is a much more specific level than a state or a region. And so what we would like to see is all of this information integrated. You know, from a sub-watershed to state to region to national level. And we see the possibility of integration as the real hope here.
Anyone else like to respond? Mr. Nutter, and Mr. Nutter, by the way, it's always great to have you as part of these hearings because you bring the economic implications of much of this to the fore, which is crucial to consider. And it's in fact why a lot of us have moved, a lot of communities, a lot of industries are moving in the direction. Let's respond now when we have time.
Well, thank you for the question and the comment. From the insurance perspective, regional assessments are probably imperative. There is not much point in looking at a national assessment without understanding the subcategories of all that. The effect of climate change on extreme weather events in the Gulf is different than it is for a state like Florida or an East Coast or Upper East Coast. The same would be true. The same comment would be true if you're looking at the effect of extreme weather events in the Midwest, the tornadoes and other extreme events. So from our perspective, the regionalization of the assessment is frankly the most valuable part of this whole thing.
Very, very good point, very useful. Dr. MacCracken.
I think that's also a very good question. We tried, because there are a number of issues there that cut across, to have sector assessments do that. So you wanted to cross-cut with that. And so if you're interested in how the forests are going to do health-wise locally, you want to have a regional one. If you want to understand the market for forest products, you have to look more broadly, certainly across the country. Or if you want to look at agriculture, you can look at what happens to a farmer in a particular place, or you can look at food production more broadly. So I think you need both regions, you need sectors, and the area that we didn't get to at all in what we were realized needed to get done was how what happens elsewhere in the world affects what happens here. So that can be everything on natural factors like migratory species to what happens with our investments. When there was a drought in Indonesia several years ago, there were layoffs on Wall Street. I mean, the world is interconnected with investments. It's certainly interconnected with respect to health, and it's certainly interconnected with respect to environmental refugees. IPCC looks at some of these, but it sort of does the chapters a little bit separately and hasn't looked at how one set of countries depends on another and the various economic connections. So there are a lot of different cuts that have to be taken, and together that is how you draw forth the findings for a national level report that would be meaningful to members of Congress.
There's an interesting school of thought out there when it comes to this challenge we face of responding to global change, and we're having a discussion today, or climate change, or both. If we can figure, I should say, when we figure this one out as the human race, that we'll actually have created a template to deal with a lot of other challenges and opportunities and problems that we face across. And that keeps me going every day, given the size of this and the complexity of what we face.
The report that we did, that this UN panel recently did for the Commission on Sustainable Development, tried to very much make that point that climate change is intimately tied to meeting the Millennium Development Goals. And if you don't think about climate change in the context, you're not going to be able to ensure meeting the water needs and the other kinds of things in particular regions, or severe weather or other kinds of things. So it is indeed all coupled and has to be done that way, looked at that way.
I know my time has expired, but Mr. Inglis and I have reached an agreement. I think he's asked questions he would like to ask. I'm going to go for a few more minutes, and then we'll begin to bring close. But I did want to turn back to Mr. Nutter, if I might, for a minute, and ask you a question about the large population growth in high-risk areas that's exacerbated the impacts of climate change. Would you comment on how H.R. 906 might provide information to reduce the vulnerability of these already overstressed areas?
Thank you for the question. To the extent that the assessments can help not just our industry, the insurance industry, but those who regulate our industry and those who look at protecting people's property and lives through building codes or other hazard mitigation, can learn from the information about increased frequency or severity of storms and other research products from this program, it would have enormous public benefit and obviously the private benefit to all of us who are engaged in risk assessment or risk mitigation. So I see it as a valuable product largely as we try to understand the dynamics of a changing climate when we have, my recollection is 53% of the U.S. population lives within 50 miles of a coast. That's a pretty remarkable exposed population. The state of Florida has $2 trillion of insured properties. The state of New York has $2 trillion of insured properties. My recollection, Mr. Inglis, is that your state has something like $150 billion of insured properties. It is a remarkable exposure, and our ability not only to deal with the financing of recovery from extreme events, but understanding the dynamics so we can protect property and life from that would be a byproduct of this legislation.
Thank you for that response. Dr. MacCracken, I'd turn back to you briefly. You recommend keeping research on climate change science separate from that on energy technologies. I assume you're referring to technology development research. At some point, however, shouldn't we evaluate new energy technologies, their potential deployment schedules, their costs and their emissions profiles, to see how they will impact atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases? And in general, where should this analysis of issues that intersect the science and technology development occur? Easy question, I know.
Yeah, I was, in my comment, just trying to keep to make sure that the research that goes on about what's going to happen and the decisions about what technology research you fund are not so closely intermixed that they bias each other. That you say, well, I think the fear was in some of the 1990s that people will use climate change to justify funding fusion research or something, and you really wanted to pursue those kinds of things separately. Certainly you have to look at what will happen in terms of technology. And in fact, if I can just go back to comments that Ms. Bittleman and Phil made, when they called for a national climate information service, that's absolutely vital, but there's some other things we need as well to project into the future that we struggle with, and that includes what's going to happen to the nation's ecosystems, sort of the land cover projection, what's going to happen in terms of demographics and in economics and technology. One of the things we struggled with in trying to put together a useful assessment was to project, well, what's really going to happen? Are there things around the corner that are going to mean that this isn't the problem? How are we going to adapt to it? And one needs to have some sort of perhaps central facility to make that happen, or maybe it's a virtual program or someplace where it comes together, but it can't just be climate information service, because as soon as you say, well, I've got the climate information service, then people are going to ask, well, what's happening with economic development, or what's happening with demographics and population, and where people are choosing to live, and all these other issues. And that whole social science part of what needs to be in global change isn't really well funded and doesn't even have much of a constituency. There aren't a capability for it.
Dr. Mote, I'm going to move to you now, if I could. And if I could ask, you want to comment on that, and I'd ask you a question?
Yeah, let me just comment on another aspect of this sort of separation that Dr. MacCracken talked about is, in some instances, mitigating and adapting to climate change do come together. For example, evaluating the resilience of hydropower to a changing climate, or wind power. So as we design portfolios of future energy, are those portfolios themselves resistant to or resilient to the kinds of changes that may come down?
That's a very, very good point. Some cases may work to power needs benefits, in other cases it may actually work the other way.
Yeah, for the Pacific Northwest,
hydropower
warming climate actually helps our hydropower production because it puts availability of supply more in sync with regional demand. It sort of leaves California in a more difficult position because then we don't have spare power to sell in the summer. But
I'm going to not be tempted to comment on that as a Coloradan, but let me turn to RISA for a minute. And you discussed it as an example of a stakeholder-driven climate sciences venture. How could the climate program be tailored to build upon the work being done by RISA?
Well, the key success of the RISA program has been putting top-level scientists directly in touch with top-level decision makers on the regional, state, and local scale. And to some extent that happens nationally, but these are partnerships that lead to better science because the science is then driven by a genuine societal need, and it also leads to better management because the decision makers are slowly learning more about climate. Again, it's not just about future climate change, but the patterns of variability that we already experience, paleoclimate, evaluating how robust is the Colorado River Compact, given the 400-year perspective that we get from tree rings, things like that.
Thank you. You had to bring the Colorado River into this.
Well,
it's the lifeblood of
I drew my first breath 42 years ago today in the high mountain air of Colorado. So
today's your birthday?
Yeah.
Well, happy birthday. Well, maybe we should. Well, I think that's a great place to stop at this point. I did want to yield to Mr. English for a couple of concluding remarks, and then we'll bring the hearing to a close.
So I'm going to sing. I will spare you, but happy birthday. And I thank Mr. Udall for chairing this part of the hearing, and appreciate his work on this. And it's been very helpful for me to hear your comments. So thank you for the education you afforded us today.
Well, let me conclude by thanking you all for appearing before the subcommittee. It's clear, I hope, to all of you and those listening and those participating today that I take the challenge, as does Congressman Inglis and many of us here in the House, of addressing global warming very seriously, and it's one of our highest priorities in the Congress. Your testimony, as we've said, has been very helpful, and I believe that this legislation will take an important step forward in providing planners with the tools they need to combat climate change. Under the rules of the committee, the record will be held open for 2 weeks for members to submit additional statements and any additional questions they might have for the witnesses. At this time, the hearing is now adjourned.